Sarah always believed that marriage meant becoming part of a new family. She loved David, and she wanted to build a good relationship with his parents. They were polite to her, though a little distant, and she hoped that over time they would grow closer. Every Sunday, David's mother, Mrs. Collins, invited them for dinner. She always prepared a large meal with different dishes: roast chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, fresh salad, and warm bread. Sarah was happy to be included, but something strange kept happening. Every time she ate dinner at their house, she felt sick. It started with small things: a stomach ache, a little dizziness, a feeling of tiredness. At first, she thought she had eaten too much. But then, the symptoms got worse. After a few dinners, she started feeling sharp stomach pain, nausea, and sometimes even vomiting. She didn't want to be rude, so she kept it to herself. Maybe it's just bad luck, she told herself. Maybe I ate something that didn't agree with me. But then, she noticed something strange. She never felt this way at home. During the week, she and David cooked meals together, and she always felt fine. She ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner without any problems. But the moment she sat down at the table in her in-laws' house, her body reacted badly. One Sunday evening, after another painful dinner, Sarah lay in bed, her arms wrapped around her stomach. The pain twisted inside her like a knife. She felt dizzy, her head spinning. She could barely move. David sat beside her, his face full of concern. "Sarah, this is the 4th time this month. We need to see a doctor." Sarah nodded weakly. She didn't want to worry him, but she also knew something wasn't right. The next day, they went to the doctor. After a full checkup, the doctor frowned. "You're perfectly healthy, Sarah. There's no infection, no allergies, nothing unusual in your tests." Sarah and David exchanged confused looks. "Then why do I keep getting sick?" she asked. The doctor leaned forward. "Are you eating anything different when you feel sick?" Sarah thought for a moment. Then suddenly, it hit her. "It only happens after I eat at my in-laws' house." The doctor's expression became serious. "That's interesting. It could be food poisoning. But if others aren't getting sick, there might be another reason." Sarah and David left the clinic feeling uneasy. If there was nothing wrong with her health, then what was causing this? That Sunday, as they prepared to go to his parents' house, Sarah felt nervous. "David, maybe I shouldn't eat much tonight." David squeezed her hand. "We can find out what's going on. Just be careful." Sarah sat at the dinner table, watching Mrs. Collins serve food. The dishes looked delicious, but for the first time, she felt afraid to eat. As she lifted her fork, a strange thought entered her mind. Was someone doing this to her on purpose? She shook her head. No, that was ridiculous. Why would anyone want to hurt her? And yet, as she took a bite, a deep feeling of unease settled in her chest. Something wasn't right. And soon, she would find out the shocking truth. Sarah sat at the dinner table, trying to ignore the growing sense of fear in her stomach. The warm scent of roasted chicken filled the air, and Mrs. Collins smiled as she passed Sarah a plate. "Eat up, dear. I made your favorite." Sarah forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins." But inside, her mind was racing. She picked up her fork and hesitated. Was it really the food making her sick? Or was it just a coincidence? She glanced around the table. David was eating. Mr. Collins was eating. No one else seemed to feel sick. So why did this only happen to her? David gave her an encouraging nod, so she took a small bite of mashed potatoes. The creamy texture melted in her mouth, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. She decided to be careful. This time, she would eat slowly and pay close attention to how she felt. Halfway through dinner, the familiar nausea started creeping in. A dull ache twisted in her stomach, followed by a wave of dizziness. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her fork down. David noticed right away. "Sarah, are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Sarah swallowed hard and forced a smile. "I just need some air." Mrs. Collins' eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she quickly nodded. Of course, dear. Take your time. Sarah stood up carefully and walked toward the kitchen. Her legs felt weak, but she pushed through it. She needed to think. She needed to find out what was happening. Then, as she passed by the counter, something caught her eye. A small jar sitting near the sink. It was half hidden behind a basket of bread. Curious, she stepped closer and picked it up. The label was slightly worn, but she could still read it. A powdered herb mix. Her heart started pounding. She had seen Mrs. Collins sprinkle something on her plate before serving her. Could this be it? Just as she was about to open the jar, she heard footsteps behind her. What are you doing? Sarah jumped and turned around. Mrs. Collins stood in the doorway, watching her closely. For the first time, Sarah saw something cold in her mother-in-law's eyes. Is something wrong, dear? Mrs. Collins asked, her voice sweet. But there was something off about it. Sarah tightened her grip on the jar. Her pulse raced. Was this the answer she had been looking for? Had she just discovered the truth? Sarah felt her heart pound as she gripped the small jar in her hands. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt thick, heavy with tension. Mrs. Collins stood in the doorway, her expression calm, but her eyes were watching too closely. Is something wrong, dear? Mrs. Collins asked again, her voice smooth, almost too sweet. Sarah forced a smile, trying to keep her hand steady. I was just looking for some water, she lied, quickly setting the jar back on the counter. I wasn't feeling well. Mrs. Collins' gaze flickered to the jar for a split second before she smiled. Oh, of course. You should sit down, Sarah. You've been looking pale lately. Sarah swallowed hard. Pale. Was that concern in her voice or something else? She gave a small nod and hurried out of the kitchen, her mind spinning. Back at the table, David noticed the worried look on her face. He reached for her hand under the table. Are you sure you're okay? He whispered. Sarah hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Collins, who had returned to her seat, acting as if nothing had happened. She couldn't say anything. Not yet. I'm fine, she whispered back, but she wasn't. That night, when they got home, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, deep in thought. That jar, what was in it? She had to find out. She turned to David, taking a deep breath. David, I think something is wrong. He frowned. What do you mean? Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but she had to tell him. Every time I eat at your parents' house, I get sick. And tonight, I saw your mom using a strange jar. I think she's putting something in my food. David's face changed. First confusion, then disbelief. Sarah, that's crazy. My mom would never do that. Sarah's stomach tightened. Then explain why I keep getting sick. Why only me? David opened his mouth to argue, but then stopped. He wanted to defend his mother, but deep down, he knew Sarah wasn't the type to make up stories. I need proof, Sarah said finally, and I'm going to get it. David watched her, uncertain. How? Sarah met his gaze, determination burning in her eyes. Next time, I'm bringing my own food. And then, we'll see the truth. The following Sunday, Sarah and David arrived at his parents' house as usual. But this time, Sarah had a plan. Inside her purse, carefully hidden, was a small food container. She had prepared the exact same meal they usually ate: mashed potatoes, grilled chicken, and vegetables. But this time, she made it herself. As they sat at the dining table, Mrs. Collins smiled warmly. Sarah, I made your favorite again. Eat up, dear. Sarah hesitated for a second, then smiled back. Thank you, Mrs. Collins, but I actually brought my own food today. I've been feeling unwell lately, so I wanted to try something lighter. The moment she said it, the air in the room shifted. Mrs. Collins' smile didn't fade, but something flickered in her eyes, something sharp, something unreadable. David glanced between them, sensing the sudden tension. Mom, that's okay, right? She just wants to be careful." Mrs. Collins chuckled softly, setting down her spoon. "Of course, dear. But I must say, Sarah, that's quite unusual. Do you not like my cooking?" Sarah kept her face calm, her hands steady. "It's not that. I just want to see if it makes a difference." Mrs. Collins didn't say anything for a moment. Then she gave a slow nod. "All right, dear. Enjoy your meal." But Sarah didn't miss the way her grip tightened on her fork. Dinner continued as usual. Mr. Collins and David ate, chatting about work and the news. Mrs. Collins, however, was unusually quiet. She watched Sarah closely. Sarah took small bites of her own food, while everyone else ate from Mrs. Collins' dishes. She waited, heart pounding. Minutes passed, then an hour, and for the first time in months, Sarah didn't feel sick. No nausea, no dizziness, no stomach pain. Her chest tightened as the truth hit her like a wave. It was never the food. It was never an accident. Someone had been poisoning her. And now, sitting right across the table, wearing the same polite smile as always, was the person responsible. Sarah met Mrs. Collins' eyes, her hands gripping the table. She knew now. She knew everything. But the real question was, what would she do next? Sarah's hands trembled under the table, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew the truth now. The food at her in-laws' house was making her sick, and Mrs. Collins was the one behind it. But why? She looked up and met Mrs. Collins' gaze. The older woman was watching her, a strange smile playing on her lips. Did she know that Sarah had figured it out? David was still eating, unaware of the silent war happening between his wife and his mother. He had to know, but how could she tell him? Would he even believe her? Sarah took a deep breath and pushed her plate away. She had to do something. "Mrs. Collins," she said, keeping her voice steady, "can I ask you something?" Mrs. Collins raised an eyebrow. "Of course, dear. What is it?" Sarah hesitated, then carefully chose her words. "Have you been adding anything special to my food?" The room fell silent. David looked up, confused. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" Mrs. Collins let out a small laugh. "Oh, Sarah, what a silly question. Why would I do that?" Sarah clenched her hands into fists. "Because every time I eat here, I get sick. But today, I brought my own food. And for the first time in months, I feel fine." David's fork clattered onto his plate. His face paled. Mrs. Collins, however, remained calm. Too calm. "Are you accusing me of something, Sarah?" she asked sweetly, but her eyes were cold. Sarah's heart pounded. "I just want the truth." Mrs. Collins sighed, shaking her head. "Oh, Sarah, you never should have married my son." David's eyes widened. "Mom, what are you saying?" Mrs. Collins leaned back in her chair, her smile fading. "I never wanted her in this family, David, and I had to make sure she wouldn't last." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She had admitted it. David stood up so fast that his chair nearly tipped over. "You were poisoning her, my own wife." Mrs. Collins didn't flinch. "I was protecting you, David. She's not right for you. She doesn't belong here." Sarah's head spun. All this time, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was planned. And now, David knew the truth too. But what would he do now? What would they do next? David's face turned pale as he stared at his mother. His own mother. The woman who had raised him, loved him, and now tried to harm his wife. You were poisoning Sarah." His voice was barely above a whisper, filled with disbelief and anger. Mrs. Collins sighed, as if she were exhausted. "David, sweetheart, you don't understand. I did this for you." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "For him? You wanted to hurt me, to make me sick. How does that for him?" Mrs. Collins' expression hardened. "Because you don't belong in this family. You've changed him, Sarah. I had to do something before it was too late." Sarah felt her stomach churn, not from sickness this time, but from sheer shock. "You wanted me gone." Mrs. Collins nodded slowly, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Yes, and I would do it again." David ran a shaky hand through his hair, stepping back. "Mom, I trusted you. I defended you." His voice broke. "How could you do this?" Mrs. Collins' face softened. "Oh, David, you'll see, in time. I was only protecting you." Sarah couldn't take it anymore. Protecting him from what? From being happy? From loving someone? Mrs. Collins' lips pressed into a thin line. From a mistake. Sarah's heart shattered. A mistake. That's what she was to her. David turned to Sarah, eyes filled with guilt, regret, and something else. Pain. He had to choose. His wife or his mother. Sarah held her breath, waiting. David's hands curled into fists. Then, without looking back, he took Sarah's hand. "Come on," he said. "We're leaving." Mrs. Collins' eyes widened. "David, no. Don't do this. I am your mother." David stopped at the door, his back to her. "And she is my wife." Then, without another word, he led Sarah outside. The cold night air hit them, but Sarah could barely feel it. She had won, but at what cost? David was breathing heavily, his eyes filled with heartbreak. His mother had betrayed him. And now, nothing would ever be the same. David and Sarah walked in silence, their hands still locked together. The night air was cool, but Sarah's heart was pounding too fast to feel it. She had never imagined things would end like this. David's mother, the woman who had raised him, loved him, had tried to poison her. And now, David had made his choice. He had chosen Sarah, but the pain in his eyes was impossible to ignore. When they reached their car, David leaned against the door and let out a deep, shaky breath. "I can't believe this." His voice was hoarse, filled with disbelief. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "David," she started, but he shook his head. "She lied to me, Sarah. She looked me in the eyes and lied. My own mother." His voice broke. How could she do this? Sarah's chest ached for him. She knew how much he loved his mother, how much he had trusted her. And now, that bond was shattered. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, "but I do know that you didn't deserve this." David exhaled slowly, his gaze meeting hers. "Neither did you." A heavy silence hung between them. Then, finally, David straightened, his jaw tightening with resolve. "We're never going back there, Sarah." His voice was firm now. "She made her choice, and I made mine." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. He had chosen her. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "We'll be okay," she whispered. David held her tightly, as if grounding himself. "Yeah," he murmured. "We will." As they drove away from his parents' house, Sarah glanced at David. He was staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. He was hurting, but he wasn't looking back. Neither was she. This was a new beginning, a fresh start, and though the past had left scars, they were stepping into a future where no one could hurt them again.